The last American who still remembered the old world, what she told her family before she died in 1953. Inside the Library of Congress sits a quiet filing cabinet filled with the voices of long-gone Americans, not audio recordings, but written transcripts. Thousands of pages of interviews written by hand or typed between 1936 and 1940. Government writers traveled through 24 states with one simple mission: record people's stories before they disappear forever. This effort was known as the Federal Writers Project, created during Roosevelt's New Deal. It gave jobs to struggling journalists, researchers, and novelists during the Great Depression. Their task was simple: document the lives of ordinary Americans. By the end, they had collected 2,900 life histories. Those interviews were stored inside the Library of Congress, where they remained mostly untouched for almost 40 years. I didn't discover them intentionally. I was researching architectural records from the 1870s, trying to understand why so many American courthouses and government buildings from that era had proportions that didn't seem designed for the people who supposedly used them. But the deeper I explored the archives, the more I realized the real mystery wasn't the buildings. It was the people. Those 2,900 interviews captured something no textbook could ever show: first-hand memories from Americans who lived before everything changed. And what they remembered doesn't fully match the history we were taught. Think about the timeline. An American born in 1855 who lived to age 85, a very normal lifespan, would have died around 1940. That means many of those people were still alive when the government writers knocked on their doors. They had lived through the 1860s and 1870s as children. They personally witnessed one of the most dramatic transformations in American history, and their grandchildren born in the 1920s and 1930s heard those stories directly. Those grandchildren became the last generation to carry the oral memory of the old world, and most of them are nearly gone today. Take Mary Kelly. She was born in 1,851 inches, Southfield, Michigan. She lived to be 113 years old and passed away in 1964. She was born before the Civil War and lived long enough to see televisions inside American homes. Then there was Maggie Barnes. Born to a formerly enslaved mother in the early 1880s, she lived to around 115 years old and died in North Carolina in 1998. These weren't rare cases either. The Gerontology Research Group has confirmed 16 supercentenarians born in the 1850s alone. Many more people lived past 100, and hundreds lived beyond 90. That means an entire generation of witnesses existed, people whose lives stretched across two completely different eras. The government had the chance to record their memories. It captured 2,900 of them. Then the project suddenly stopped. Funding ended in 1939 after congressional hearings, and the program was shifted to state control before quietly fading away. The interviews were boxed up and weren't widely published until the 1970s. 30 years passed with almost no attention given to the final living testimonies of Americans who remembered what came before. Before what exactly? That question becomes impossible to ignore when you look at October 8th, 1871. Every American learns about the Great Chicago Fire, the story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the wooden buildings, the rebuilding of the city. But almost no one learns that the same night, at nearly the same hour, fires erupted across multiple states. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a massive firestorm wiped out the entire town in roughly 1 hour. Between 2,000 and 2,500 people died, making it the deadliest wildfire in American history. The flames destroyed over 1.2 million acres. Survivors described winds strong enough to lift people off the ground. Flames moved faster than anyone could run. The heat was so intense that some victims ignited simply by crossing open areas. Reverend Peter Pernin survived by plunging into the Peshtigo River. In his 1874 account, he described something strange: the fire burned so aggressively that it consumed oxygen itself. Some victims showed no burns yet were found dead, as if the air had suffocated them. The fire even created its own weather system, a violent vortex of superheated wind that behaved less like a typical forest fire and more like an explosion spreading outward. And that same night, other cities burned. Holland, Michigan burned. Manistee, Michigan burned. Port Huron, Michigan was threatened. Across roughly 225 million acres of the upper Midwest, fires erupted on the same evening. The National Weather Service confirms this timing. The official explanation blames drought, lumber debris, and powerful winds. Reasonable except for one detail that researchers have questioned since the 1880s. All of it happened simultaneously. In 1883, some researchers suggested fragments from Biela's comet might have ignited fires from the atmosphere. The theory resurfaced in a 1997 documentary and again in a 2004 investigation by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Witnesses in Chicago even reported blue flames burning in basements, something more consistent with unusual chemical combustion than ordinary wood fires. The theory has never been proven, but it also hasn't been fully dismissed. And here's the key point. The elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s were children in 1871. A 70-year-old interviewed in 1938 would have been 3 years old that night. An 80-year-old would have been 13, old enough to remember the sky turning red, old enough to hear their parents describe what happened. The Library of Congress summaries say those interviews include stories about the Chicago fire and pioneer life. But that description barely scratches the surface. What else did those Americans remember? What did they tell the government writers about the night everything burned? And why did the project end before the full picture could appear? The fires weren't the only disappearance. In 1890, the United States conducted its most detailed census ever. For the first time, every family filled out an individual form recording immigration status, language ability, home ownership, and Civil War service. 62.9 million Americans were documented. But unlike earlier censuses, copies weren't stored in local offices. The entire record existed in one place, the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. Then on January 10, 1921, a fire broke out there. About 25% of the records were destroyed immediately. Another 50% suffered severe water and smoke damage. No definite cause was ever confirmed. But what happened next was even stranger. The surviving records were placed in storage. For 12 years, nothing happened. No restoration, no copying, no preservation effort. Then, in December 1932, the Bureau of the Census submitted a list of documents scheduled for destruction. The 1,890 census was on it. The Librarian of Congress was asked if any of the records should be saved. He chose none. Congress approved the destruction on February 21, 1933. The next day, February 22, President Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, a fireproof facility built specifically to prevent the loss of important records. The census was destroyed just one day before construction began on the building designed to protect records like it. Out of 62.9 million names, only about 6,160 survive. And then there were the orphan trains. Between 1,854 and 1,929, around 250,000 children were transported by train from cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia to rural communities across the Midwest. At stops along the route, families would examine the children and choose which ones to take home. Many worked on farms. Less than half were actual orphans. Many were simply children of immigrants or poor families who couldn't support them. And when those children arrived, they were often encouraged or required to cut ties with their past. Names changed, origins were lost, records were incomplete. Hundreds of thousands of Americans grew up without knowing where they truly came from. The timing of everything is hard to ignore. The fires in 1871, the orphan trains relocating children, the disappearance of certain records, the architectural shift from grand classical structures to simpler designs. Then came 1,893, the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Over 6 months, 27 million people visited what was called the White City, more than 200 enormous neoclassical buildings spread across 630 acres. Official history says they were built in under 2 years using plaster, cement, and wooden frames. No cranes, no bulldozers, just horses, hand tools, and manual labor. Then, after the exhibition, nearly every building was demolished. Only one major structure survived, the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry. Many of the elderly Americans interviewed decades later remembered visiting that White City. They described something that felt completely different from the world around them. Something older, something grander. And then it vanished. I keep imagining a woman in the early 1950s living in a small American town. She was born in the 1850s. She's in her 90s now. Her grandchildren sit around her kitchen table while she tells stories. Stories about buildings that seemed ancient when she was young. Stories about the night the sky turned red across multiple states. Stories about trains full of children traveling west with no names and no families. The grandchildren listen politely, but the textbooks say something different. And in 1950s America, the textbooks always win. The Federal Writers Project captured 2,900 voices from 24 states. But what about the other states? What about the thousands of elderly Americans who were never interviewed? Their stories lived on in family conversations, and then slowly disappeared. Today, the last grandchildren who heard those stories are in their 80s and 90s, the final human link to that earlier world. But those 2,900 interviews still exist inside the Library of Congress. They've been public since the 1970s. Searchable, readable, waiting. And it raises one final question. Has anyone carefully read every single one? Because somewhere in those transcripts, written by government workers during the Great Depression, are the memories of Americans born before the transition. And those words are still sitting in the archive, waiting for someone willing to read what the last witnesses actually said.